Okay, and we're back for SPA reporting. So, Michael, do you want to present? I'm assuming that people are here or will be here shortly. I don't know if we should. I think we can probably get started and people will show up.
All right. Well, thanks for the opportunity to present this. Initially, this session was scheduled for half an hour, and I thought there was no way in heck that we would cover all the content. I'm happy to see it move to 1 hour, but I had cut aggressively on these slides and frantically re-added some things this morning, so apologies if something's out of place. All right, so single page app SPA metric reporting. So as a quick intro for anyone who is unaware, single page applications are sites which dynamically rewrite the current page content instead of loading a new page using the browser. And on naming, I will tend to use SPA navigation, but that is just one type of this problem. And so soft navigations is also used somewhat interchangeably to more broadly be applicable to all of these types of sites. These are commonly built using frameworks like Angular, JS, Ember, Backbone, or React. Some of these frameworks are sort of fully featured where they include support for this type of routing and URL changing and all this other stuff. Others like React have common components like React Router that are used to add this type of functionality. It's also very, very common to use the hash fragment portion of the URL or the history API to keep the sort of serializable state of the page in sync with the page content so that you can copy and paste and that sort of thing. There are many common problems that we've known about for years and we've talked about for years. Many RUM metrics and tools are written to measure traditional page load performance. And there's a general lack of synthetic testing for any type of post-load performance, which includes all post-load like client-side transitions like SPA navs. And because of that, SPAs tend to have more blind spots in measurement. At best, this just leaves us in the dark on a large part of UX. But at worst, and this is increasingly common, we tend to measure some of the worst cases of interactions, and this paints an entirely inaccurate picture of overall performance. And so the measurement reports don't match the real world experiences, and we get this feedback all the time. But just filling the gap the wrong way risks painting an inaccurate picture in the opposite direction. So it's not quite as simple as just do this, right? Okay, so hopefully I will tee off these topics to be discussed further. Different types of SPA navs, classifying SPA navs, measuring SPA navs, and then various topics around transitioning from MPA to SPA. MPA being a sort of traditional multi-page application. Just gonna check to see if folks are still here. All right. So types of SPA navs. So we often talk about this as if it was just one thing that's easy to paint with a single brush and easy to identify. But the reality is there are plenty of variants. From the UX perspective, there are sites that will do full page recreations that look to the user almost exactly like a traditional navigation. The site will almost go blank first and then repaint with totally new content. It's also very common to have a sort of common site template where you'll have like a navigation header and some toolbars on the side and settings, but the main content will swap out within it. You'll also have sites that have tiny little components that update almost independently. You can imagine like a financial website with individual instruments that are updating every second or something like that. All the way to infinite scrollers where they might not even be updating the URL. And as you're scrolling, you're just getting new content loaded in, and each piece is as if it was its own little portion of content. And then the way loads are actually implemented varies quite a bit as well. So good examples are dynamic, where pages load exactly what they need when they need it, which is true sort of by default for traditional navigations. You also have large portions of common code and common templated, but still loading dedicated distinct views as needed, all the way to just preload everything. Take everything you might possibly need, including some menu that might occasionally be open, and still preload it just in case, just so that the transition is instantaneous. And this could be anywhere in between. This preload everything seems to be especially true for JavaScript. And then for initial load, there are pages that will use client-side rendering even for the initial load. So you get almost a blank canvas and then gets, which is the traditional load type, and then you'll get client-side rendering to server-side rendering, which is a typical dynamic preview of a page, which follows up with hydration, which upgrades the site from like a static page to a sort of client-side app. And then for subsequent loads, like within the client for soft navs, some of them are in response to interactions that the users clicked on things, and some of them are automatic, like YouTube will auto advance to the next video when you're done watching the current video. All right, so with that in mind, there are some patterns that exist already and some strategies we might adopt in the future for classifying SPA navigations. So the most popular are to rely on developer hints. So many frameworks already have clear signals for the start of a route or transition, as well as for any view update. But it's not necessarily clear when all of the relevant view updates have finished applying for any given route start or end. You might even have like a soft end, which is noted, which is like all of the work that was kicked off has been kicked off, but it doesn't mean that it's all been applied. There has been some good work in the past, including things like zone.js from Angular, which attached sort of a context across async work. And this almost gave you out of the box the ability to track the last piece of work that was sort of completed in response to some task that was started. But this doesn't actually work with modern JS. There's a bunch of things that broke. I think with the async and await patterns don't work with zone.js strategies. Although yesterday we heard about scheduling with post task and the ability to add potentially some sort of context that persists across async work or async tasks, and then maybe long task attribution, which I think Patrick will talk about tomorrow. These are all things that could help here in terms of automatically tracking, as well as some of those responsiveness works that Nicholas talked about yesterday. Some RUM frameworks today already annotate pages. So they'll ask the developer to provide the hint of when the sort of soft nav started, and then they'll listen to network usage and DOM updates using Mutation Observer and add hooks for tracking all this work completion. And I think I linked to Boomerang and some documentation about what they have there. And then I've previously, and I think this has been discussed for a while, talked about adding developer hints via user timings. So rather than each framework and each RUM platform re-implementing the wheel and doing it a different way, we already have an API for developer hints through user timings. And maybe if we relied on a convention, then we can hook on the same signals. So I linked to a previous presentation on that here. I think a little bit's been evolved, but this is still work we hope to do. Ideally, in the future, we could perhaps automatically track soft navs using heuristics. So perhaps something like if there was a recent input and the history change and network and cache was just used and there was a DOM update, something like that. But it's really hard to get this right, especially with what I said earlier, which is there are so many different types of navigations and how they're kicked off and what they actually tend to do. However, if we had really trustworthy and widespread user timing hints, then maybe we could do more experimentation here to test against heuristics and find what exactly correlates the most. Finally, there is some work towards possibly adding a dedicated client-side nav API. So there's ongoing work around the HTML5 history API to fix various flaws that exist already. And there are complaints from framework authors about like history state disappearing or changing, or various workarounds that you have to do to make sure that it works correctly. And so there are proposals to fix these flaws, but one of them would be to provide an API that's like a well-lit path just to do all of the right things that most frameworks have to do manually today automatically. And this could be also used by us to be a clear signal. It might not help with measurement directly, but it would at least give us something to hook onto reliably. All right, so if we had these signals, what goes actually into measuring a single page navigation? So first off, responsiveness. So we have event timing, which not only gives info about the first input, but also all long duration events post-load. And ideally, we would use something like this to track the whole end-to-end duration of the SPA navigation itself, especially if it was due to a user interaction. So Nicholas presented yesterday about what goes into end-to-end duration, including the async portions of work. And we talked about various strategies we might use to track that. And if we had this could be the equivalent, perhaps, of an onload for a SPA nav. But beyond just the transition itself, we probably want to track the next input after a SPA nav to, again, to the first input after a page load. And right now, event timing will only report this if you have a long duration. So if you only care about input delay, you could polyfill this by registering handlers. And there's a similar problem here with BF cache, which I think is going to be the next talk after this. But we might want to have, even for like relatively short duration, have more information about end-to-end responsiveness. So it'd be neat to sort of reset event timing to say, at least for the next input, I'm interested in it, no matter how fast or slow it is. And then with responsiveness, perhaps moving beyond first load towards like all inputs across the page, the new issue that comes up is attribution, which we'll discuss shortly. Okay, paint. Paint is often the most troubling thing to measure. So we can, of course, track the very next paint. You get this both with event timing via the duration to the next paint, as well as just by calling request animation frame. But what we're really more interested in is the next contentful paint, or the next largest contentful paint. So for SPA navs that are a full page recreation, this seems possible to define. And maybe we can even just reuse first contentful paint or largest contentful paint and just have multiple entries for the same entry type. But it definitely gets more problematic with partial updates, which I think tend to be more common. So the very next paint is almost always contentful, because there's some site template already around, or some stale content that still hasn't unloaded from the previous route. So perhaps we really only want to consider new content that's being added, or perhaps we want to only support, or perhaps we want to support constraining content within a single DOM subtree, something like that. For visual stability, I mean, layout shifts already do get reported for full page lifecycle, which is good. However, CLS today is accumulated and reported for the initial page load only. So I'll get into attribution in a moment. One difference, though, between page load and soft navigation is that layout shifts that happen post-load will get this signal about had recent input, because we want to make sure to ignore shifting for things disappearing or moving in response to content, like after interaction, which makes sense. But for new content that was added during a soft navigation and then shifted, it really is similar to during page load, where it gets added early on in the page and then still shifts. So even within the first 500 milliseconds, for new content that was added and then shifted, it would be more equivalent to page load if you did count that shift. So food for thought. I think this is a trivial issue. I just wanted to call it out as a difference. All right, and perhaps the most interesting part, and one that I've been trying to think about a lot recently, is just both transitioning from multi-page app to single-page app, as well as like thinking through issues and differences between them. So some common patterns in feedback that we hear often are when you move from MPA to SPA, you all of a sudden measure many more page views as identified by your own analytics, which include SPA navs, if you're counting them yourself, but you're seeing fewer reported page loads as identified by most analytics tools, including things like Crux. And then for things you're measuring yourself, you're typically seeing faster transitions between page views, even though you're seeing slower reported initial page loads. So there are these conflicting reports. And then, of course, some metrics just don't make sense for SPA, and there are things to improve there. And so when you're doing a big transition from MPA to SPA, there's a lot of things that change at once, which makes it really hard to measure. So, a big software rewrite with different performance characteristics makes it really difficult to pinpoint what's due to your new pages being slow versus SPA to MPA differences themselves. And fewer page loads means that you have a different distribution of hot and cold cache loads. And then when folks say that they have more page views, it could be because just better post-load transition performance leads to longer sessions and more routing. But it could also mean that you just have lots of little bite-sized routes being reported now where you previously wouldn't have reported at all. And sometimes there is a temporary bump due to UX refresh, or is it a sustained difference? And then I talked already a little bit about problems with metrics like CLS and blind spots in measuring. All right, so in terms of attribution, ideally there would be no reporting difference between a traditional multi-page app page load and a SPA self-nav. So with each client-side route change, you would perhaps summarize the existing metrics, report them to the previous route, and then reset metrics for the existing one. After all, this is like what a user would experience. Some considerations, though, is that you can't necessarily report the exact same metrics for page load and self-nav, especially for things like paint. And then the performance of transitions depends also on the previous route. So if you imagine product pages switching from product to product, you might have most of the template already loaded where just a few assets are changing. Whereas if you're on a settings page and then moving to the main page or something like that, it might be a full page reload. And so the referrer route will impact the performance of the load. And then, of course, with client-side routing, we sometimes see an explosion of URLs with just a lot more things getting considered a transition. And so to me, this is sort of the biggest open question is how do we take these metrics and do we blend them with page load equivalence? So there's definitely a huge advantage in terms of simplicity to just blend everything together based on its URL. Users don't care how it was built. They can't tell the difference sometimes how navigation was implemented. There are similarities here to BF cache and pre-rendering and possibly visibility changes, which we either talked about or will talk about. On the other hand, many fast post-load soft navs don't compensate for one terribly slow initial page load. So if the overall time spent is the same, but it's more front-loaded, is that really equivalent? Initial impressions and bounce rates are really affected by the first load far more than by just the average. And so I think in the previous talk on preload, we heard that they both consider the performance of the preload as well as the UX of the transition as being distinct things to measure. And then distribution of overall load performance is likely to change. If you just blend everything to perform together, especially if you have total number of reports that increase, you might want to look at higher percentiles. And so the actual where you cut the line and what you look at might change. All right, so that was a long spiel, and that's all I have.
Just on that last point, where users are more likely to be impacted by the very first page that they hit than by page number 5, because by that time they're already hooked to your magnificent content. Isn't that similar for MPAs and caching?
Yes, completely. Sorry, I realized I was off mute when I made that response. Like, actually, I totally agree with you. That was going to be my point, Yo. Like, as an analytics vendor, performance is a distribution, and we see it all the time. And we see like that, whether we're looking at a full page load or multiple page load, it's always going to be a distribution. I think how you slice and dice it tends to be how developers and users of our tools like to be able to look at the data, whether they create a custom dimension or whether tools like Impulse and others like do that automatically for them, or we allow them to do that. It's about kind of segmenting your data. So a SPA load is not the same as a full page load, but if you're looking at the entire distribution and performance for your site, it's going to be included. And quite often we see those big metrics diluted quite a bit when we look at it kind of in total, which I guess, makes it more important to, again, segment, create those dimensions to kind of distinguish between the two. I liked a lot of what you said, and I think I had some questions maybe for Pat Meenan, if he's on the call still, about synthetic and how they do this. Because when you script something in web page test, I think there's, in some cases, things like LCP still being reported for SPA navigations. And I don't know if that's intended or not, or if that's a byproduct, or if it's not always going to be the same. But I think some of those paint metrics do make sense. I was actually just on a call this morning with a customer walking through this, where they had whole product details listing page, and they are moving to a SPA, and they have a load more button at the end of the page, which basically does a soft refresh, loads everything in. But they're very interested in when the largest contentful paint, or the I guess the first product image paints. So they're relying on things like element timing. They're relying on things like glass painted hero and other metrics, which I guess resemble an LCP.
Yeah, and so at least in web page test, the only reason LCP would still get reported is if whatever paint in those further navigations happens to be larger than whatever happened to load in the first part of the navigation, right? Because it's still using Chrome's candidate LCP events, and they accumulate, right? And so it happens to just be luck. There's no reset the LCP state without a navigation bit that can be twiddled, as far as I know. And so, yeah, element timing is the only real way to instrument what you care about. The visual metrics web page test does is like the hero image stuff that SpeedCurve does, where the render metrics will be relative to the state of the SPA at which point you started doing the new action. And so it's whenever something on the screen changed from that, or the speed index is relative to the start and end state of that activity. But the Chrome reported metrics don't have a way to reset.
Awesome. Thanks, Pat. That saved me a whole bunch of time this afternoon.
So
back to the customer with that.
LCP candidates stop getting reported after an interaction, though. So I believe. And so how would you have a transition, unless it was an automatically generated one, like the initial one during load, which does happen?
I mean, if they inject something on JavaScript to force the transition, that's not an input rate. So it will not count to stop the algorithm.
So is web page test instrumented to test routing?
You can, but all of the routing is going to be triggered through JavaScript, right? It's not actually going to be input events to the screen or fake keyboard inputs or anything like that.
So like a simulated click is essentially JavaScript, so it's not going to be reported, which is why. Okay, makes sense. And for CLS, so forgive me for not knowing, but is this something that can be sort of cleared in a buffer or anything like that, similar to what we see with other performance timings, or is that potentially a solution to addressing the CLS issue?
So CLS is not actually reported through Performance Observer,
right.
Just individual layout shifts, and so you have to calculate it yourself. And there's libraries like WebVitals.js that will calculate it the same way that Chrome does. As an aside, there's ongoing work to think through CLS and what it means, and perhaps better ways to sort of normalize the individual layout shift data, just because for very long-lived pages, just endlessly accumulating, and especially for single page apps across routes, it just doesn't do that well. And so that strategy might change over time. However, like if we start cutting and attributing to URL, we would want to reset basically the accumulated value for CLS. It's not something we do now.
I would say that's what we're doing in Boomerang today for tracking it with our single page app monitoring. Every time a new soft navigation starts, we just discard the current layout shifts and then accumulate a new cumulative that shift.
I'm not sure that we're doing that, but we should if we're not. Okay, interesting.
I mean, I guess it depends on whether you want to match what would get reported through something like Crux, or whether you want to improve attribution so that you can make progress. You may want to do both. To go to Yoav, back to your question, and Cliff followed up in terms of comparing initial load to subsequent page loads. There's certainly a difference in performance, and so reloads will have a different performance than the very first initial load or the first load of a session after a long while, that sort of thing. I expect that SPA transitions will have a much even bigger difference. And so Cliff, you answered that you do separate it out and then you do dig deep. But then I didn't follow. Do you find it important to separate it out when folks dig, or are you happy to blend it together and that you'd like to see more of which direction?
I guess it kind of depends. I mean, what we've seen when people are migrating to SPAs is oftentimes, those are replacing traditional page views. Those navigations are. So if you're looking at an overall number and trying to improve user experience, I think it does help to kind of look collectively at it. We don't always see increased page views just because it's a SPA. Those are still transitions that are happening just like you would see with traditional, full page loads in a lot of cases. In some cases, no, like when partial content's changing and things like that, it's kind of hard to call that a new product details page or something. So the answer isn't annoying, it depends, but I think that's having the ability to separate it. And I think, Nick has done a ton of work here. And I think, the model of how to do it really well in terms of being able to separate between hard navs and soft navs, but still being able to look at that entire distribution if you're looking at migrating to a SPA or something. I think that we've seen both.
Yeah. So I guess my biggest concern is I tried to outline the different types of SPA transitions, like they're not all equivalent in the way that they get loaded. And so my biggest concern is that, the entry point for a website, like let's say the product listing page for an e-commerce site, is paying the page load cost of pre-rendering all possible routes, and its page load perf is actually decreased. But then all future route changes are near instantaneous because they've been pre-rendered, and that they are that new product page URL is the one that gets attributed with like a near zero cost for page load. And so first of all, like just blending is weird, but then also you're blending in the wrong places because you're measuring in the wrong places, if that makes sense.
You need to measure both. Like when you want to understand like the business impact of a slow loading, you want the first load, and when you want to understand more stuff about your performance, you want the subsequent load. One thing that might be interesting is measuring first load versus subsequent load, not based on whether they're done in an SPA way, but whether they're in the same session, like they could have been SPA. Like you have the home page and then the about page, and they're in the same session. Now, when you measure those two in MPA versus SPA, in both you'll get like a better result for the second page, but in SPA you'll get much better results, and that's what you expect to get.
Yeah, also I have to say, so theoretically the path of let's preload all, like prefetch all possible things that the user can do on the very first page and then have everything else be instant is something you can also do with the MPAs and prefetch, or any other means of getting content into your cache and pre-rendering and whatnot. So these are all things that you can do regardless of architecture, and whether it makes sense or not is something you want to measure either way. And I think what I'm hearing both Cliff and Noam saying is that you want to be able to measure, like you want to be able to distinguish the first load from the rest. And then you want to be able to either look at first loads individually or blend them with the rest. And basically you want to slice and dice your data in order to extract insights from it. But you need, like, in order to do that, you need to be able to both distinguish them as well as blend them, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Agreed. it's kind of interesting because then you think about cold versus warm cache, and we don't really do much of that with RUM today, where we can we can infer, how many network requests were made and things like that to infer whether pages served from cache. But the same is still going to be true of those soft navigations, right? That have, they're loading up, 20, 30 different images. Well, if those are already in cache as well, you're getting a soft transition or spot transition, which is different than the full page load, but it's also going to be different from someone who viewed that transition before. So I think you still got that dimension to think about, which again lends itself to sort of looking at performance as that distribution, as we talked about. But it is important, I think, to be able to distinguish the different kind of page load types. So.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk about it in a second, but the absolute best type of page load is no page load. And so as we talk about like BF cache, there was where there previously was an opportunity to load, there's none now. And so is that a perf regression or a perf improvement?
Oh, do you want an answer? I just wanted to say that thanks for the talk, and like we've always discussed SPAs, like literally every TPAC or something like that, along those lines. So from my perspective, it's super clear that this is something that is needed, and there is a lot of demand for monitoring SPAs. So my main question would be, well, I guess two questions. So one would be, how do you determine when the SPA happens? Is this something that will require developer annotated things, or will require using the new navigation API that is being brainstormed right now? Or what do you think about that? And the other question is, assuming you know when the SPA occurs, what are the metrics that you would like to surface, at least as a starting point? Like, would you like to surface basically everything again, like first paint, first contentful paint, LCP, FID, or what are your thoughts on that?
Who are you asking, Nick? I'm eager to answer, but I'm eager to hear from others. Go ahead, Stephen.
Nicola, I can answer from Salesforce. Hi, this is Stephen. So we've been working, I've been working at Salesforce with SPA for 5 years now. And I think what I miss from the web platform is an API to say, hey, we are doing a soft navigation. So internally we have that. And so internally we reset everything every time we doing our soft nav. But it'd be nice if we could tell the browser, by the way, we're doing a soft nav right now, and therefore all the performance metric would reset, and we would be able to access, largest contentful paint, everything. So to me, because today the browser, when you're not in a SPA, it knows when you're navigating because you reload everything. So that's a strong signal, but we are missing that for the SPA. So when you take a Chrome timeline or when you do everything, we know in my specific framework, I know when to look when we're doing a soft nav, but I would love it if that was native. So, everything would reset. And Nicola, to answer your question, yes, we would love everything to reset. So when one of our page in SPA is slow, we can actually talk to the developer to make it faster, because we know that this specific page that we want to improve.
Hey, Stephen, can you tell us a little bit more about how you are signaling to the browser that you have a soft nav?
We are not today. Today we have our own library, and when we call our own internal move to this page, our internal instrumentation gets reset, but not the instrumentation provided by the browser.
Do you use?
So you're doing it on like the URL? Yeah, is it like?
Yeah, we do change the URL. We do. So the browser could use some heuristic to guess when we are doing a soft nav, but sometimes when you click inside a tab inside one of our page, we have tabs. This is not a page navigation, but we might change the URL. So if the browser were to implement a heuristic, they might get it wrong Instead, we would love if there was an API to just say, by the way, browser, we are navigating to a new page.
I'm trying to figure out if there's a way to do that in event timing, but yeah, curious.
So event timing now reports on all long events after load. And so you, much like layout shifts, you have access to the data with the exception of if the first input after a transition is fast, you probably want to know that as well. And so from the perspective of event timing, you want to probably reset to say, for this next one, I'm interested no matter how fast or slow it is. And so if you're only interested in input delay, which is what we've been measuring for first page load, like input delay, you could polyfill that yourself right now. So that, I think, is available to you already. If we move towards more like end to, sorry, Nick.
I thought Benjamin meant the part of annotating the SPA navigation, or did I get that wrong? Yeah, okay. So in that case, it wouldn't be in event timing. This requires really something that actually changes the URL, for example. So that would be, I don't know if, I think Michael mentioned there has been some discussions, at least internally in Chrome, about brainstorming about a new navigation API that can both fix the existing problems with the existing history API, as well as perhaps allow us to finally enable monitoring SPAs. But yeah, it requires like things like changing the URL and things like that. That's not suited to the event timing, which is just monitoring performance.
Yeah, some of the issues, there are certain issues about like UX. First of all, the history API, you can easily shoot yourself in the foot if you use it wrong. Like if anybody taps a fragment URL, the history states gets overwritten, so it's kind of unusable. And so you tend to have frameworks that completely abstract away browsers' notion of history. So these types of things are being worked on to perhaps fix. But separate from that, if you want to support things like open in new tab by default, but also support client-side routing, in the common case, you need to sort of intercept all clicks on links and handle them manually and stuff like that. And so there's some work about perhaps creating a proposal that would just simplify the default to make it work out of the box, where you get an update to the URL, it falls back to same behavior with like top-level navigation, that sort of thing. It wouldn't measure in and of itself. So if you have access to client-side hints and you're already using a framework that already fixes history problems, it would just get you to that state quicker or more reliably, perhaps. But we still have to answer these questions about measurement. And so I think that layout shift is in the best state input. I think we need to do this resetting for next input if it's important to make sure we track even that. And that seems plausible for me, to get a signal to reset the next input, no matter how fast it is. I don't know if there's like security or whatever implications if folks reset too often. So maybe it needs to be tied to an interaction. I'm not sure. The hardest one for me to think through is paint, because is next contentful paint and largest contentful paint, is it really okay to just do the exact same thing we do during page load, especially for partial updates? I fear that much of the time you'll just get the next frame as being marked as the one that was the largest contentful paint, because some existing content already on the page was larger than anything that was added. So how common is that? Do we care about doing better than just that?
I think that if we go with the approach of the application clearing some of those one-time metrics, like first contentful paint, etc., the application is best suited to decide whether to use those metrics or to use element timing or something, or user timing or something more finer. And it's actually not up to the web platform to decide that. Like, and we cannot rely on the history API, because maybe everything happened and then JavaScript called push state. But what we can do is allow the application to reset some of those one-time states, and then later decide for itself which metrics to use.
Couldn't we tell, like during that navigation state, again, just in the example of comparing layout shift timestamp of when you started the event and when the last layout shift happened, similar to LCP, ignore it if the timestamp was before the start of the navigation with the SPA. Like I guess it wouldn't require clearing anything, it wouldn't require doing anything special. You could still institute a next contentful paint, which I think is kind of an interesting idea. Or next largest contentful paint, or maybe we just call it LCP. And if there's not one, maybe it's just 0. I don't know. But it seems like it shouldn't be that complex to do today, even.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that you don't need to reset anything for layout shift. You could just use timestamps and then the nav timestamps to slice a session. And then for responsiveness, you would do that as well, provided that there's this like signal for the thing. For paint, it's different because you need a new signal that you need to ask for. The thing is that if we are, and Noam, I like your suggestion, but now you have 2 different ways to measure, and it even further complicates this idea of like, how do you blend initial page load with subsequent load with SPA, soft and like hard navigations? Because now you're measuring different things.
I just wouldn't call it first contentful paint. That's why we have entry names for it. It is a contentful paint, etc. But we can use entry names to or all kinds of things inside the entry to differ between those things.
Right, but like technically, it's like the first contentful paint after the SPA navigation. I don't know if that's
one of them.
Yeah, but we could, like, even without changing the name, we could easily distinguish between one and the other. I mean, you have the first paint entry in that was reported, and then others following that. Like, we could easily, like, also based on timestamps or whatnot. I think that the main open question here with paint metrics is whether we can report them for arbitrary things from a security perspective. I think that killing visited would go a long way towards making that seem more of a reasonable thing to do. I'm not 100% sure. Like, I know that Tim was involved in past discussions. Like, are there issues beyond visited for various like arbitrary paint reporting?
We've had an ongoing conversation with our security folks. One issue can be same process iframes, same process cross-origin iframes where they exist can leak stuff. But this is a discussion that, from my perspective, we still haven't gotten to the bottom of on our end.
One potential problem that comes to mind is, say you have an image that you want to get some information from, and then you just add it and time the first paint, remove it, then add it. So like it lets you basically get a much more granular and better estimate of the time it takes to render, which could leak some information potentially.
Yeah, and with progressive images in particular. Yeah.
Although technically you can already do that by producing a bunch of iframes and timing each iframe separately. But so I don't know if this is really a valid concern or not.
Sorry to go all the way back, but it was the idea here, the fact that, hey, we want to do something that requires as little work as possible for the developers, that's more sort of out of the box, if you will, or is it we just want to have a common way of doing it, like developer hints, that we could all hook into. You could report in Crux, and you could report in Impulse and in Lux and everything else.
Yeah, I think there were separate ideas lumped into one. One was the user timing hints. And so basically, it's a free-for-all. Everybody's doing it themselves. The frameworks are trying to get it done, but they don't have clear signals of endpoints. The analytics providers are trying to do, everybody's trying to do it. And so why don't we just come up with a convention? There's already a standard for like developer hints around timing, around user timings. And so then maybe we could get the best of breed into the frameworks themselves, and you get it out of the box for every new application built on a given framework. And then we hook into that because you could listen to these events and do whatever you will. And so you could still measure different things. So that has many advantages, but it still relies on developer hints. And like these things can happen very frequently. And the notion of a navigation changes from framework to framework and app to app. And so, it doesn't necessarily mean that every single one of these hints is like a top level transition that you want to blend with your page load metrics. So we'll have to see. But I think the first step is to add those and to start looking. And then the second thing I proposed was like, maybe this informs better heuristics, where you can use this plus other signals to say, really, this is a proper transition. Am I hopeful? I don't know. But until we see it, we won't know. And then finally, with this navigation proposal, it's really nascent, right? This is early thinking. But if we had that, one of the problems, or one of the things it purports to solve is to say, there's no reason you would use it too frequently, like it would be tied to a real user interaction, or at least you'd be able to distinguish the difference between a real user interaction. And it would have implications to the history API and to navigation and a whole bunch of UI things. So it would only be used in places where top-level navigations are used today, basically. And so it would be a useful hint to hook into that we could trust. This is a good reset point. And again, you still have all the measurement issues, but this would be a good end goal. And we'll see how that moves forward. And so distinct from just identifying, I think we still want to have answers as to like what exactly we measure. And then once we measure it, where does it go and what do we do with it? And so I enjoyed hearing that folks agree that you want both perspectives. You want the blended perspective because ultimately that's what you're striving to trade off for your users. If you do have lots of post-load interactions, you have a sticky site that does well keeping users on the site. You want to decrease the total amount of pain. And you might, for a very sticky site, want to sacrifice a bit of initial load performance in order to have lots of really good post-load interactions. On the other hand, you want to be able to slice to compare each individually, like just initial page load performance, because you want to make sure that doesn't regress too far.
I will say that it has come up, like with Web Vitals and customers that are saying, hey, this is awesome. Like we've got this insanely fast LCP or something. And, but why is it saying something different again in Crux or in Lighthouse? So I do think we are going to hear more of it. And I think we're going to have more people wanting to differentiate or at least be able to see what Chrome sees or other things. So I do think it's important. And Web Vitals is still so new that I think, we're just starting to get some of that inbound, but it will come up. It'll continue to come up.
And just to echo that from for our customers as well, we already segment our data or allow our customers to segment by whether it's a hard navigation or soft navigation, as well as whether it's a landing page or non-landing page, et cetera. And it's very obvious when you start segmenting by soft navigation or not that a lot of the metrics that we've been talking about are just not there at all. And so it comes up very frequently with our customers as well. It's like, why can't we track large contentful paint for soft navs? And we have to go through the education process of the data is just not there yet. So yeah, I just from a consistency point of view, and I know every person that's measuring single page apps today is probably doing it slightly differently, but the more apps that are being built this way, the more important it is to be able to track it.
Yeah, perhaps one concrete takeaway is if you just do the default of reporting all page loads, for multi-page apps, the default you get is a blended metric. And for single page app, the default you get is a segmented metric. And just making it obvious, the distinction, could go some of the way towards like surprises when comparing the two as you migrate between one and the other.
Sounds like a good blog post for somebody to write or add to.
Cool. Cool. So I believe we're at time. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay, or even 5 minutes over, because we skipped the break. Do folks want to take another break, or shall we just? Okay. So first of all, any last questions, urgent issues regarding SBA reporting?
I'm just really glad you talked about it. I think it's important.
Michael, what's the best place for people to provide feedback and check on status? Is there a public repo or something in the works?
No, there's no public repo, and maybe that's a good question. I forgot to think through it. So we don't actually have a very good umbrella catch. Like there are a couple of issues that are open where there's been lots of discussion on this topic, but I think we are looking for a good umbrella placeholder for all things related here. I don't know if like the user timing repo is useful around the next concrete step of getting these hints, or if I'm not sure.
Okay, we can probably talk offline, but I would suggest maybe kick off a YCG.
Can I?
Like, obviously, there's interest. Yeah, Ryosuke, you were saying?
So I kind of got lost in this discussion. I think this discussion is getting super vague because there's not really a list of concrete use cases that like we're trying to satisfy, right? I think it'll be really used to have like, okay, here's like React app, here's this, I don't know, like Twitter or something, and then study what they're doing and whether we can satisfy those cases. It will be very useful thing to do here. Like, I mean, all this discussion about, we can do this and that using this API is like super vague, If we had a concrete app that we're trying to measure, it would be way easier to judge, okay, like to support this app's use case, we need to do this and that.
Yeah, that sounds good. We could do a deep dive on a couple big apps. I've certainly taken a long look at Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and a slew of them. Not always knowing how they themselves measure, but certainly like the behavior from a user perspective, what the frameworks do. Yeah, maybe we need a session at one of the working groups just to go over an example in detail, or some examples.
Yeah, I think I'm also curious. Like, there's quite a few like people from who maintain like a large website like a Salesforce who would probably be able to are probably doing some kind of measurement right now, and it will be. I'll be curious how they can, hook into their apps, right? Because that would ultimately that's the goal. So I mean, it'll be really nice to know what they can do to support. Like, for example, I have app, dashboard app, and then the way app updates URLs, the URL changes afterwards, right? So that would mean, I mean, there are many apps like that too. I mean, and there are multiple ways to write router, and one way is to just update the thing and then update the router, and also supports the going to the routed place and then load the page. Yeah, so it's to me. I mean, so another thing is it's unclear to me, right? Like, what would be a page navigation? Because in some cases, it's page navigation in SPA is really partial navigation. It's not really a whole page too. So I don't think we really discussed those examples, but it'll be really interesting to learn more about what are the set of navigations. What are the things that various apps consider as navigation? Like list of ways the navigation is achieved, and what they really consider to be a navigation. Because I don't even think there's an agreement, across all the apps and the frameworks.
Yeah, I attempted to sort of showcase just how much variance there is here, but I did it in slides and text instead of visual examples, so that's good feedback. And yes, history updating is a single moment in time, whereas a transition is a span of time, and different sites do it differently. Some update the URL instantly at the beginning of a transition. Some will update at the very end when everything's finished. Others commonly will kick off a bunch of work. If the kickoff sort of succeeded, then they will update the URL. But then there's a bunch of browser follow-up work to actually load and render and that sort of stuff. And so it is a big async process. And history is just one moment in time within that transition.
Right, and I think there are some cases where they do some sort of a like in-app pre-render kind of thing, where they think the user will load this next thing, so they would like fetch all the relevant JSONs, right? And then they would just basically render that content. In that case, navigation, like you almost have some sort of like it's like a browser within a browser, right? In that, like it has all these features to like fetch the content and the render content, and then but we don't want to get start thinking about the pre-render in a single page app and stuff like that too. So I think there's something that we might need to do specific to SPA, where we need to be able to measure things that are that happen before navigation. Does that? Like it's sort of like we date the things. Okay, like I actually did this other thing before we started this SPA navigation.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I'm hearing what I want to hear, but the previous conversation about pre-rendering, I think Dominic pointed out that they want to measure the performance of the pre-render and the performance of the UX to move to visible or whatever it is, or transition to the main content. And I hadn't previously thought about attributing the performance cost of the pre-render to the future route. Right now, if we report it the way we're doing it, you actually would get, the thing that's doing the pre-rendering is the thing that's loading, because it's not nicely segmented. And so Yoav correctly pointed out, like you could use modern browser features even in an MPA to have these patterns. And maybe in those cases, it's easier to attribute like forward. The cost of this pre-render was attributed to that. So anyway, it is, it does get complicated. I will agree with that.
Yeah, so maybe a right action item here would be to kick off some repo around the problem, maybe more than the solution. So just a repo to collect use cases, and then we can have Steven and others and large properties contribute from their experience as to what they are trying to measure, and we could try to summarize that into something that can guide what we are trying to expose, along with all the questions that we already know that we'll need to answer.
Yeah, I think another useful thing is to document what different frameworks and websites are doing the SPA navigation, right? Like sort of model of SPA navigation itself. Like, do they fetch the data before they navigate, right? Or do they update the URL and then navigate and start loading stuff? I think the understanding the model or documenting the model will be, I think, useful, because if whatever for the WebPerf working groups purposes, just understanding the metrics will be useful. But I think if we had this document of okay, do this kind of navigation, I think it'll be useful for discussion for other working groups as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is lots of great documentation existing, but maybe just even a doc that links out and coalesces or summarizes is useful.
Yeah. Okay, so shall we move on to the different yet somewhat related subject of BF cache reporting. Let me present.
Should we get the 5-minute break?
Sure. Yeah. So yeah. Let's go for a 5-minute break and reconvene at 13 after the hour.